Good afternoon. We'll start by identifying our victim. I know a press release was sent out a little while ago. It's Stephen Ammenhauser, 53 years old. Just to tell you a little bit about Stephen, he lived at 500 Lyell Avenue by himself. He's originally from the state of Texas. He's predeceased by his wife, and his longtime girlfriend passed away in October of last year. And he's originally was adopted, and unfortunately there was no family in his life at the time of his death. So the reason I'm telling you a little bit about him, because there's nobody else to speak for him. On March 12th, about 12:30 p.m., Stephen walked from his apartment to a corner store, came back, entered his apartment. About 5 minutes after he entered his apartment, he came running out of the apartment on fire. There were some citizens who attempted to render aid to him by trying to put the fire out. Rochester Police Department and the Rochester Fire Department responded, and Stephen was rushed to University of Rochester Medical Center, where he was at the burn trauma unit until he passed away at about 4 o'clock this morning. Since the time the call came in, the Rochester Fire Department's arson task force, in cooperation with the Major Crimes Unit, immediately began an investigation into the incident. What we had learned during the course of the investigation is that Stephen was doused with a flammable liquid while sitting in the chair of his apartment, and then he was intentionally lit on fire. There was 2 individuals located at the scene. When the police and the fire department responded, they were both spoken to. They both provided false names. They were ultimately transported here to the public safety building, and they were both identified as the 14 and 16-year-old who have subsequently been arrested and charged. And I know the names were given out in the press conference. If you guys need them again, I'll be more than happy to provide them to you. The 14-year-old had an outstanding juvenile delinquent warrant in relation to a previous robbery. So he was initially lodged on that warrant and that warrant alone. The 16-year-old was charged with the assault first and attempted arson on the 12th. The 14-year-old was subsequently charged with the arson and the assault first a couple days later. This afternoon, upon learning of the death of Stephen, we did bring a warrant over to family court judge for murder second, which was ultimately signed. And it's my understanding that the 2 individuals will be in court tomorrow at some point in time to be arraigned on those charges. That's pretty much what I have for you guys as far as the Lyell Avenue thing. If there's a few questions on that, we'll try to answer them as best we can.
Was there any relationship at all between the 2 teenagers charged and the man who was set on fire?
They knew each other. They were not family. Stephen, he was in declining health. He was not in very good health. I would say that he was somewhat vulnerable. And, you know, he had some issues. And the kids, they hung around in the neighborhood, and if anybody knows that neighborhood, you know, everybody kind of knows everybody. So they certainly, the suspects certainly knew Stephen, but there was no type of familial relationship. They were known to each other.
Do you know what would have prompted it?
You know, Berkeley, I wish I could answer that question. I don't. Like I said, Stephen was vulnerable because of his declining health and other issues, but I don't know.
They were in the apartment when he returned, so would that have been when he would hire them to help him out around the house, that kind of relationship?
No, he definitely would not hire them for anything. We don't know if they were in the apartment already, or if they happened to see him walking in and followed him in, or if they saw the door open. We don't know. But Stephen was alone in his apartment when the incident occurred.
How do you know it was them?
Can't get into the evidence that we have, but we know. You know, interviews were conducted that night. We did retrieve some physical evidence, and beyond that, I can't get into the evidence of the case. But they were interviewed that night.
Frank, you see a lot. You see a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Can you even start to talk about this?
No, I can't. I've had, like I said, I have seen a lot. There's a few cases that stick out. you know, seeing the pictures of this guy and then knowing that he has no family around just to speak for him, I can't. This is one that I'll remember. You have a few others. Charlotte Lahr, if anybody remembers her, who was beaten to death in her liquor store. That was horrible. I mean, I go down the list of other ones, but this was bad.
Did the suspects themselves know each other? Were they family members, friends?
They know each other. They know each other well.
That robbery, sorry, Mark, that robbery instance, what department, what jurisdiction is that? Is that RPD case?
Nope, that was, there's actual multiple robberies. In September, he was arrested in the town of Gates for a robbery. He was arraigned in front of a judge after the robbery. He was immediately released and given a court date for the following day. He was arrested again in December for a robbery that actually occurred in October of last year. As a result of the investigation, he was identified in December and ultimately arrested. He was given an appearance ticket again because we have to. And then in January of this year, he was arrested for being in a stolen vehicle and again given an appearance ticket. On March 5th, I believe it was, the juvenile delinquent warrant was signed by a judge. And I believe that was for the Gates robbery, but honestly, it was all very confusing.
And the December case was what jurisdiction?
The December case, it actually occurred in, I believe it was October, and that occurred in the city of Rochester.
And what was the December part of it?
The crime occurred in October.
Right, okay.
Investigation took some time, and he was ultimately identified and arrested in December.
Were drugs involved in this, or was there any sort of gang relation or anything that could have happened?
I have nothing to say, if nothing to point that there was drugs involved in this. And as far as the gang part of it, I can't comment on that.
So you're not prepared to say why this happened?
Well, I don't think anybody's prepared to say why this happened.
All right, so we're going to be all set with that portion of it. Thanks, Frank. If there's any other questions for the executive deputy chief, we have a couple more minutes and we can address those.
Executive Deputy, first of all, can you just explain more about the, are you guys going to be training the officers to be implementing these new policies, or how is it just springing up on them? How are you alerting your officers to give them enough time to adjust to all these new policies?
You know, before I answer that, as you had an opportunity to hear Captain Frank Umbrino, and I think you can see, you know, obviously an outstanding investigator really cares and is extremely difficult with respect to what he sees, the men and women of the police department see on a regular basis. And, you know, I just have to acknowledge that, you know, the compassion in his heart, the conversations I've had with him and his team is evident. He truly cares about the victims and places a great emphasis on solving crimes. You know, rolling out training is important. Our training will be rolled out in a number of different ways. Some of it will be rolled out by way of policy updates that every employee in the organization will have to read the policy as well as acknowledge that they received the policy. There's other ways that we're going to do training. Right now, we're preparing to have a different myriad of different training that'll come out. Some of it is in draft form, so I'm not able to speak to all of it, but I can kind of give you an idea where we're going. We're looking at reaching out to some trainers from throughout the country that we would like to bring in, maybe in like a TED Talk type of conversational training, so that we can also allow for our employees to see some outstanding leaders that have national experience, while at the same time placing it in a forum where people can understand and grasp what we're doing. So there's a number of different ways we're going about training, but our plan is to ensure that every member of the police department, our sworn employees, get all the training that we have upcoming, and that's kind of how we're going to do that. But again, we're in a, right now we're preparing and it's in a draft mode.
So it's going to go beyond just a roll call, just handing something out at roll call and being done with it, right? This will be actual, they will be able to practice practice this and do role playing and things like that?
Yeah, I talked to our training staff yesterday, and that's led by Deputy Chief Tommy Shaw and his team, who talked about making sure that it's not just a roll call training. I mean, you know, just providing information to the employees where they just sit down and read information is one way, and they will receive that. But really, as you indicated, is getting people into different scenarios, observing what transpired, getting them involved in the training themselves is something that we're looking at. So we wanted to have a myriad of different ways to get this training out, and one of them is getting the employees actually involved. So, and thank you for asking, because that is very critical.
When do you expect that the policies for de-escalation and mental hygiene arrest, when do you expect that those policies will be unveiled to the public?
Well, you know, as I answer these questions, I'm also going to ask Captain Muir to come up as well, because he's involved. We plan to have the training for each area completed within the next 3 weeks. That is our plan. We have a graduated schedule with respect to how we're putting things in place. And so we're pretty confident that we'll meet that timeline. But part of the reason why we're doing that is because as we roll out the policies, we want to give the employees time to digest what they're receiving. So initially, you're going to see the policies come out. And that's where employees will read the information as well as acknowledging that they received the policy information. Then following behind that is when you'll actually see some additional training that'll be a little more hands-on and things of that nature.
What are your thoughts on members of the community calling for a federal monitor for the RPD? Do you have any thoughts about that and how that would affect the jobs of officers here every day?
You know, for us, I think with what the mayor, the police chief, and the community has been doing with respect to the Executive 203, we're already actively engaging in reform. And generally speaking, from my experience in Ferguson, I'm very familiar with what that looks like. We're already doing a number of those things now as we plan. So, you know, our job is to listen to the community and acquiesce to where we're asked to be and to serve in a way that would allow for us to have a fantastic professional police department. So for me, on behalf of the chief, really don't have any comments, whether pro or con. All I do know is that we are doing a lot of things that will allow for the reform to take place through the leadership here. I think, given my experience, that we're on the right track, and we just need time to implement the changes we have.
In the duty to intervene, it says when it is safe to do so. What does that mean? And if it's when it's safe to do so, couldn't something escalate to a point where there could potentially be a problem if the person didn't feel it was safe to then intervene at that point? Can you explain the duty when it is safe to do so?
Sure, I can do that, and I'm going to ask Captain Muir, do you want to speak on that, or would you like for me to?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, Chief, and then I'll step in and add to it.
Sure. So, you know, we give, obviously there's examples when an employee should intervene, and to simplify it is really if an employee observes a situation where there's a need to de-escalate, meaning we see an officer actively involved in a situation, they need to take what we call a tactical pause, because perhaps they may be too focused on what they're doing. In those instances, what our expectation is a police officer that is there to actually intervene. Now that could be either touching the officer, pulling them back, or having a conversation with the officer to ensure that they're aware that maybe perhaps their approach to the situation is escalating to a point where we don't want it to go. And that's going to take some time. And generally speaking, we have officers do that on a regular basis, but really we want to make sure we make that part of our culture so that as number one, employees know that it's going to occur, we encourage it to occur, and the community can accept that they will see that happening on a regular basis. Captain Muir?
Sure. So just to add to that briefly, as you could imagine, being a police officer is a high-stress job. Officers out on the street come across things every day that most people will never see in their entire lives. So when you're actively engaged as a police officer on the street and you're dealing with a situation, depending on whatever it is, it could be a fatal car accident, it could be an active shooter scene, it could be anything like that. The stress level is incredibly high, and as human beings, it's easy to understand how somebody who's dealing with a situation like that may be hyper-focused on what's directly in front of them. They may not see the entire picture. They're looking at what's in front of them and dealing with that. So for another officer to step in and maybe see the big picture and see potential problems that could be arising, that's where we need that officer or officers, plural, to step in and say, hey, hold on, I got this. Something else has happened and you need to take a step back and let me handle this. I got it. And then they can discuss it after the fact. So that's part of what that is, because with a job such as this, you don't always see everything when you're focused on what you're dealing with right there at that moment.
When it says safe to do so, what, safety for whom? For everybody involved, for the officer, for the?
For everybody involved. For everybody involved. It could be the officer, it could be the individual the officer is dealing with, it could be the officer who's going to intervene. It really just depends. Again, it could be a circumstance where you have an active shooter or somebody with a gun. So there's all kinds of situations, and it's really everybody's safety.
Does this mean a lower ranked officer will be able to step in? Let's say if a higher ranked officer happens to be the one doing something they feel may be going too far, would the lower ranked officer be able to step in?
Absolutely.
That's what you're encouraging?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're running out of time, so how about one more question? If anybody's got one more question, we'll take that. Everybody good? All right, great. Have a good evening. Thank you for coming down to the Public Safety Building on short notice. Appreciate it. Chief, anything else you want to add?
Yes. I just want to add this. You talked about other officers intervening. I think it's really important for everyone to understand that we have some good leaders here that are embracing the duty to intervene at all levels of the organization. We have great community members that are actually not only recommending we make change, but they're demanding we make change, and we hear you. We hear what you're saying. So it's going to take time, but as always, I'm asking the community to have faith in our leaders. I know that there's been some challenges, but we are working through them, and we are identifying fantastic leaders within the organization to bring the reform that's necessary. And that's what's important right now, for us to continue to identify those great leaders as well as the great community members to come together and help us forge a community policing platform that'll be fantastic for Rochester. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Chief, I'll be right up. All right, everybody good? All right, I appreciate you guys coming down. Todd, I'll see you later. Take care, Patty. Take care, everyone.